Introducing Sister Lorraine, Garase, and Iain Campbell-Smith, who have traveled a long way in order to come to our presentations tonight here in Moscow, Idaho. They've come to discuss the Bougainville Women for Peace and Freedom movement. Bougainville is a small island in the South Pacific between the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. And about 15 years ago, they ended a civil war there. And what you were watching here for the documentary was actually a bit of what Iain did with his peaceworking process while he was working on peaceworking in Papua New Guinea and in Bougainville. Sister Lorraine is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of Nazareth, and she's also the coordinator for the Bougainville Interchurch Women's Forum. She's participated in peace processes both in Bougainville and overseas. From the early days of the Bougainville crisis, women's groups played an important role in initiatives to end violence and promote a sustainable solution to the conflict in Bougainville. Women of all political, religious, and regional groupings mobilized and spoke out for peace. By drawing on non-politicized women and as a pan-Bougainvillian and ecumenical organization, the Bougainville Interchurch Women's Forum played a crucial role in the peace process in the island. Sister Lorraine continues her ministry on Bougainville as she works with people in need. Iain Campbell-Smith, our other speaker tonight, is a professional singer-songwriter and former Australian diplomat. He graduated in law and economics from the Australian National University, and in 1996, he joined the Australian Foreign Affairs Department. Around that same time, he began writing songs and developing a second career as a performing artist. Between 1999 and 2003, Iain was sent to work as a civilian advisor to the Australian Army peacekeeping mission on Bougainville following the civil war on that island. Iain became fluent in the Pidgin language of the region and used his skills as a musician and radio broadcaster to help promote peace on the island. His songs became famous on Bougainville, and his work there is the subject of the documentary film called Bougainville Sky, which you saw a caption of today, which we showed earlier this afternoon. On returning to Australia, Iain produced an award-winning CD, Bagger Rap Empires, containing a collection of the songs from his experience on the Bougainville Island. Iain is presently working as a musician and as a songwriter in the United States. Please help me to welcome Sister Lorraine Garase and Iain Campbell-Smith.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Sister Lorraine has come a long way from Papua New Guinea via Australia. It took her 14 hours to get here. And it took me 20 hours to get here, but I only came from Philly. I've been doing some lectures on the East Coast about the Bougainville peace process, and I know that some campuses on the East Coast are corduroy-free zones. So if anyone's got any problem with me wearing this, just mention it now. I'd like to be sensitive to you. Now, Sister and I are doing this way. I'm going to be on this side of the stage, she's over there, and we'll have the PowerPoint in the middle. And this reflects Bougainvillian culture and churches there where the women sit to one side and the men to go to the other side. And another consideration is this is my baggage arrived late, and so I haven't had a chance to wash, so she insisted that we'd be 20 yards apart. Anyway, have a seat. And I'm going to introduce this topic a little bit, and then invite the sister to speak a bit about her own experiences. So the first question on everyone's lips, I guess, is where the hell is Bougainville? It's at the end of this archipelago. that sweeps down from Indochina. And you see Papua New Guinea there, and the Solomons is where the tsunami hit 2 days ago. Bougainville is just to the north of the Solomons. And the history here is that this whole area was run by the Germans and the English in 1900, and they had to decide what to do with some border lines, and so they sat down at a table in Germany somewhere. And you know what they're like, the British and the Germans, they love straight lines. They drew one straight down the middle of the island there to the west, and one on the other side between Bougainville and the Solomons. Now, there are 800 different languages spoken in the region between those two lines. So, like a lot of countries in the world today, border lines don't reflect ethnicity, and that creates problems. Some of you might know a bit about this part of the world from the Second World War. Americans were intensely involved in fighting on Guadalcanal and in Bougainville. Thin Red Line was a film about American Marines on Guadalcanal, just south of Bougainville. It's a picture of some American Marines in the jungles of Bougainville, 1943. Bougainville has a population of 200,000 people, most of whom live in villages scattered all over the islands. There's no big cities. It's villages spread everywhere, rough roads in between, big rivers, mountains. Christianity is a very dominant religion there. 99% of the people are Christians, 88% of them are Catholic, and it's a very strongly followed religion. I guess the missionaries came to New Guinea around the beginning of the 19th century. Land is owned matrilineally by women. It's passed down from a grandmother to a daughter to her daughter. And that's a very fundamental part of the society. So when men marry, they move to the village where the woman is. The economy, mainly agriculture, and they mainly eat what they grow. So, we're here to talk about a conflict, the Bougainville conflict, and I'm going to talk a little about how that got started. Well, first of all, the people on Bougainville Island were ethnically completely different from the people in the rest of New Guinea, so they never really felt much of identification with New Guinea. And when Papua New Guinea was given independence in 1975 from Australia, it was a trust territory at the time, many people in Bougainville felt that they should have been separate from New Guinea, but it never went anywhere, but it was a sentiment that lodged in their breast. And then there was an extraordinary event. 1973, an Australian mining company called CRA started a thing called the Panguna copper mine, a huge copper mine. Between 1973 and 1989, this copper mine supplied a third of the world's copper trade. It provided the Papua New Guinea government with 40% of its tax revenue. So one mine on a faraway province provides 40% of the tax revenue for the whole country. So you can imagine how the Bougainvillians felt about that. And it also dug a hole in the middle of the island, right there, Panguna, near Arawa. It was a hole so big that you can see it from the moon, apparently. I haven't been to the moon. And as a consequence, it caused a lot of problems. It brought some wealth to Bougainville, but it caused a lot of problems. It caused environmental damage. It caused the rivers to turn blue, and that's in an environment where people drink their water from the river, directly from the river. It caused a lot of economic inequality, and it also displaced a huge number of landowners who lived in the area where the big hole was. And this is what caused the problem in the end, because people in Bougainville are very attached to their land. If you take them off it, you're going to get problems. And so these tensions built up, and in 1988, a handful of militant landowners got together, formed a militia, stole some TNT from the mine storeroom, blew up an electricity pylon that took electricity up to the mine. The mining company reacted by closing the mine to protect their workers. The Papua New Guinea government freaked out because they were losing tax revenue. the mine was shut down and held by the BRA, the rebels, the militants. The Papua New Guinea government responded very heavy-handedly. They sent in the troops and the riot squad boys. And these boys committed some awful human rights abuses. They were really there to flush out the militants. They were there to chase the militants. But they sort of committed the sort of mistakes of counterinsurgency that the French committed in Algiers and that the Americans and Australians committed in Vietnam and Iraq. They tried to interrogate boys to see if they were militants. And of course, if they weren't militants before they were interrogated, they certainly were afterwards. And they went into the bush and they fired on villages from helicopters and generally lost all respect for humanity. And here's a quote from a woman, Josephine Saviri, who was the wife of one of the rebel generals. So all of this sort of thing fanned the flames of Bougainvilleans' desire for independence. People ran into the bush and hid and fought. It just made them resent the New Guineans more than they ever had. And this is a song I wrote from the point of view of a young rebel soldier. It's called When She Cries. From our village down below, smell of burning, hear the gunshots. My house I can rebuild when it's time to start a new life. But what they did to my wife, 'cause it seems now to me now that when she cries oceans, she finds ways to hide. When she bleeds roses, she bleeds all inside. So we followed that platoon and we waited in the big bush. Later on one afternoon, we caught them in an ambush. I got that corporal in my sights, put a bullet through his forehead. But even now that he's dead, no such thing as revenge, because when she cries oceans, she finds ways to hide. When she bleeds roses, she bleeds all inside her sight. When she cries oceans, she finds ways to hide. When she bleeds roses, she bleeds all inside. There's something in her eyes, constant and persistent. Even lying between her thighs, she's somewhere in the distance. Friend, you say we won the war. I'm telling you, that depends. 'Cause for her it never ends. 'Cause it seems now, to me now, that when she cries oceans, she finds ways to hide. When she bleeds roses, she bleeds all inside her sight. When she cries oceans, she finds ways to hide. When she bleeds roses, she bleeds all inside. So in the early... So as you can see, the conflict began down in the south of Bougainville, and that time Sister Lorraine was up in the north in a town called Borah, And Sister, can you tell a little about your first experiences of the conflict when it started?
My first experience of the conflict was going through a military roadblock. And for the first time ever, having to experience being harassed, interrogated, and also the rebel roadblock, being insulted. And my other experience is when the government imposed blockade. And for me, it was like, and for the rest of the people, it was like their freedom taken away. Because before the conflict, we were a community that was very peaceful. Never heard about people arguing with themselves, no tribal war whatsoever. So that is my first experience of the conflict, knowing that already there was a war.
So after the government forces started going on the rampage, this small group of militants formed themselves into a more formal army called the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. These are them here. You can see them there. Some handmade weapons there, but in the middle is a great big Japanese 50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. The area was held by the Japanese during the Second World War, and they refurbished this. So they basically scrounged initially to find the weapons. And they became a very effective fighting force and drove the Papua New Guinea army off the island of Bougainville in 1990. But then some of the BRA boys, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army boys, started to lose discipline and started to carry out vendettas against people, particularly in the north of Bougainville. And this caused other Bougainvillians to resent and fear the BRA. And so a third force developed called the Bougainville Resistance Forces, and they teamed up with the New Guinea Army. They invited the New Guinea Army back to Bougainville Island, up in the north of Bougainville, in Buka, in 1991. And they took resources, guns, weapons, ammunition from the PNG Army, and they started fighting against the rebels. And that was a really sad thing, because you had Bougainvillians fighting each other. One brother could be fighting another, very much in the same way that happened in the American Civil War. It was chaos. The Bougainville rebels went on the rampage. They burned every bit of infrastructure they could find from the mine, billions of dollars worth of stuff. There was a massive displacement of people. 60,000 people out of a population of 200,000 moved into refugee camps. And the others, well, they went into the hills and lived with the BRA, were protected by the rebels. And that was a very harsh life, because people had lived from their gardens and they had to restart their gardens, rebuild their sanitation, rebuild their houses. And it was a frightening time for many people. At the same time, the New Guinea government imposed a full blockade around the island, monitored by patrol boats, armed patrol boats, as a consequence of which no medicine got into Bougainville, no food supplies got into Bougainville. And that really was a big killer. During the course of the crisis, about 2,000 people probably died from gunshot wounds, from fighting, from extrajudicial killings. Another 13,000 are estimated to have died from curable diseases, breech births in childhood, in childbirth, urinary tract infections, malaria, all those things that could have been cured beforehand and couldn't be afterwards. And of course the sanitation in the care centres in the mountains was no good, and that really killed people quickly too. There was a lot of localized fighting all over the island. Certain parts of Bougainville were held by the rebels, certain parts were held by resistance and the Papua New Guinea Army. And it was a war very much like Vietnam. It wasn't pitched battles, it was ambushes, it was assassinations, snipers, and raids on villages in the middle of the night. Civilians took a huge bore a huge brunt in this. Civilian populations were attacked routinely, particularly by the defence forces, but also by the BRA. So, the crisis years, 1989 to 1997. Lorraine, tell us what it was like for you and other women during the crisis years.
When the conflict started, I was just then appointed by our bishop to head a special committee to work on women's issues. So when the conflict came, I kind of felt that it was my responsibility to mobilize the women, even in the middle of this blockade. And because I was living up in North Bougainville, I organized that part of the island, and we used to use like bush telegraphs, send messages behind the back with people, and because we had other committee members living in Central and South Bougainville, so somehow messages got to them. And I used to even send messages through the rebel, because it wasn't like all of them were bad. There were some of them that were good. They had a sense of justice and peace in them. They knew that it was no good fighting a war. So we mobilized women to protest against the war. At the end of 1990, the Papua New Guinea government decided again to send their forces back into Bougainville. So they first landed on North Bougainville. And when they did that, there was a lot of heavy fighting. And I organized the women on the northern tip of Bougainville and sent messages to the island of Borah, and they organized. And we, on the same day, we stated a protest march by marching across the rebel roadblock and into the army, the defense force territory. So we did things like that. And beside that, we organized peace prayer vigils all night, from sunset to dawn, even though that was another way of telling the rebels and the defense force, because they were imposing curfew, like that you are not allowed to walk around at night or things like that.
Curfew,
yeah. So to protest against that, we had all-night peace vigils. Whether they liked it or not, we did it. And we did it by, we used to call it coconut light night. We used to make coconut oil and light it all night and just sit there praying and singing all night. We used to call it silent peace protest. So we used to do things like that. And sometimes, there were a couple of times I had to just push my way past the roadblocks. At the beginning of 1991, because of the heavy fighting and that, I actually crossed the border, the rebel roadblock, the defense force roadblock, and I did it with a young man from the village. He followed me around, and I went to the commander in charge of the defense force and asked him and told him that I had brought a message from the chiefs to slow down the fighting so that we could negotiate. So that happened. But we used to do a lot of what I call behind the kitchen door consultation. Like whenever I knew that there was a rebel leader who was soft-hearted or who understood, I would go to him and negotiate with him and consult with him and ask him, please, can you talk to your comrades or whatever they are and ask them to slow down the fighting. We don't want war. So the women, for the women, we used to do things like that. We even, in North Bougainville, in 1994, we organized for 60 women to travel to Port Moresby, which is the capital of Papua New Guinea. And for every single one of the 60 women, they paid for their own plane fares. And we took a petition to the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea and asked him to withdraw his forces or whatever to begin genuine negotiations with the people of Bougainville, with the leaders on Bougainville. So we did things like that. So we took the 60 women, went and met with the Prime Minister, even though he didn't like it, or the people that worked for him didn't like it, but we demanded. And we got the women from Papua New Guinea to support us and to get us to speak to the Prime Minister. So we did things like that. The Bougainville Interchurch Women's Forum, which I worked for, and I'm responsible for starting that organization, when after Operation High Speed 2, Papua New Guinea launched an operation to totally wipe out the rebel or the people of central Bougainville, because that they kind of felt that it was the stronghold for the rebels. So they thought that they could do that, wipe out, completely wipe out that part of the island. So they launched the Operation High Speed 2. And we knew that it was coming. So what we did was we organized for a Bougainville-wide Women's Peace Forum. And we organized for 700 women to go to central Bougainville and have a peace forum. And the theme for the peace forum was in search of genuine peace and reconciliation. But it was not an easy thing to do. It took us 12 months just to prepare for that. And for me, it was a very bad experience. I used to be, there were times when I was detained by the PNG Defense Force because of trying to do things like that. Me and a colleague of mine at one stage were held hostage in demand of, for the BRA to come out, the rebels to come out, to surrender to them. They used to do things like that. And when we organized the forum, and where we held the forum was heavily guarded. These 700 women meeting, and 2 armored cars there, these blue bulletproof cars, was sitting there, and about 20 to 25 defense force men with heavily armed with guns, just guarding the assembly hall for the 5 days of the meeting.
And you hired a boat to get everyone there?
Yes, we actually hired a boat because we couldn't go around the island to collect the women. The roads were all blocked. There were rebel roadblocks, army roadblocks. So we couldn't do that. And then the army said to me, we're not going to remove those roadblocks. There's no way you can go around. And to hire a boat to take the women around, I needed about 30,000 kina to do that.
About $15,000.
So I went to the premier and I asked him, if possible, could you give us this amount of money so that we can hire a boat? Which they did. The government in Bougainville agreed, and they gave the money to hire the boat. So we took the women to the meeting place in central Bougainville. So we did things like that. And because of the fact that the women from behind the blockade in the rebel control area couldn't come to the meeting, our friends in Australia, it was called the Bougainville Working Group. There were NGOs, mostly churches, church groups in Australia that supported Bougainville and have been supporting Bougainville for many years. They formed a group which they called the Bougainville Support Group. And I got in touch with them, communicated with them, and they organized for me and a couple of women from behind the blockade to meet in Australia. So we met in Australia and had 5 days of consultation, negotiation, and then we came up with a statement, a joint statement, one voice statement, that we demanded our leaders to decide to stop the war. We demanded for the Papua New Guinea government to stop the war. We demanded that the combatants who were fighting the war to stop it. So we did things like that. And for us, it was like, we called it grassroots peace building.
During that period of the crisis, 1989 through to 97, were there experiences that you had that still make you feel sad, or what sort of things happened to you and others that you know of during that time?
I had a lot of my friends, a lot of my schoolmates. Some of them died. For women, they died from childbirth. I had a close friend of mine who, she was from South Bougainville. In 1994, the Defense Force there was a massacre in the area done by the Defense Force and the resistance. And this friend of mine had a cousin who was 4 months pregnant, and when they had the massacre, she was killed in the massacre. And the worst thing that they could do, the Defense Force, with no respect whatsoever, they cut her open and left the fetus lying. And 3 weeks after that happened, I was asked by Amnesty International to go there. So actually at the time they were having flights to CY, the South Bougainville. So I took the flight. I asked the pilot, he was a Bougainvillian, to help me get there. But in that part of Bougainville, the army was, the Papua New Guinea army had a strong kind of and resistance was very strong there. And they really resisted the BRA, the rebels. So somehow we had to work in with people who supported us to get me through, just through the roadblock and try to negotiate and get to that part of South Bougainville. I had to walk for 2 days to get there, across the hills. And when I got to the village, I saw this village and I thought about my friend and her cousin, and I thought about the women and children that died. And for me, it was just... And we only found, me and the 2 people that were accompanying me, the only person we found in that village was an old man. And he couldn't speak pidgin English. I couldn't speak the language, but I could understand the language. So he was trying to tell me about what had happened and where the people had run away to. They went into hiding, those that were, that were able to get away quickly. So for me, it was really a sad time.
So I guess the picture that we got is not an uncommon one in modern conflict zones. Women were targeted during the conflict, but they also, on a day-to-day basis, they did a lot of the really hard work to maintain families in refugee centres, in the hills. They bore the brunt of childbearing without medical supplies. They carried the water, cooked the food, planted the new gardens. And I guess it's natural then that women form a really strong constituency for the peace movement, which you were very much a part of. So the conflict went, and it went till about 1996. Sister Lorraine referred to a thing called Operation High Speed 2. Basically what happened is the PNG Defence Forces got impatient and they said, right, we're going to go and hit these guys hard. And they launched an assault on central Bougainville, around that area, Kieta. However, a lot of the BRA guys were former PNG Defence Force soldiers, and so their intelligence was great. They knew it was coming, they waited on the beaches and cut them down. And this led to some incredible pain and frustration. For the Papua New Guinea people, the experience of the Bougainville conflict was very similar to the American experience of Vietnam and Iraq. The body bags were coming back. It was expensive, and the war was going nowhere. It was a heartbreaking thing. They were better armed, but they couldn't win. And this impatience built up, and it was at its height in 1996, and fear and suspicion amongst the resistance and the rebels was at its height. And frustration in Port Moresby, the capital of New Guinea, was at its height. And yet, by July 1997, a peace process had begun, and it was a peace process that eventually brought peace to Bougainville. And it's an extraordinary story, and it happened, I guess, for 2 reasons. Firstly, during 1997 and the years up to 1997, a natural grassroots constituency for peace developed amongst the church groups and the women's groups and the village chiefs, and they really formed a support base for the more moderate elements of the Bougainville rebel forces and the resistance forces. That was the general trend. And general war fatigue started to get to people. The rebels got tired of fighting. And then there was a very specific event called the Sandline Affair. basically, in their frustration, the Papua New Guinea government, in the beginning of 1997, decided to hire some mercenaries called the Sandline Company. Really lovely guys from South Africa and Britain. They wanted to go in with cluster bombs and just wipe out the Bougainville rebels in one blast. And so these mercenaries came to Port Moresby, the capital of New Guinea, in March of '97. And Sister, you were there at the time, yeah?
When that happened, I was in Port Moresby attending a World Bank conference on poverty alleviation. And they had booked us into this 5-star hotel. I couldn't stay in that hotel for one reason. Why would I live there if we were discussing alleviating poverty? The other reason was that by that time it wasn't safe for me to go to Papua New Guinea. I was under surveillance by the Papua New Guinea government and their defense force. So it wasn't safe for me to live in the hotel, so I stayed with an aunt. And one morning when I was coming into for the conference, one colleague of mine he was a Papua New Guinean working with an NGO in Papua New Guinea, he called me aside and he said to me, "You come to the full site, you come with me." So I walked with him to the full, and he said to me, "You see those people?" And I said, "What people? There's so many people there. Those white fellows." And I said, "I can tell the difference. All of them are white." And he said, "You see the fellows with tattoos on their arms? Only cook him skin long sun." What is that?
Cooking skin long sun means getting a suntan.
So he said to me, "You see those fellows? They are mercenaries." And I said, "What? I've never heard about the word mercenary in my life." He said, "They are mercenaries. They are being sent to Bougainville. They are going to wipe you out." I said, "Excuse me, you must be joking." And he said, "Why would I joke? I'm not joking." And then I said, "Okay, now you tell me, how did you find the story?" And he said, "Because I was drinking with them in the bar last night, and one of them gave himself, he told me the story. They are being sent to Bougainville. They are being brought here today from Port Moresby. They will go to the army camp, one army camp in Papua New Guinea, in Wewak, where they will train Papua New Guinea soldiers."
So the first thing that you knew about was just a bunch of guys standing around in Speedos and around the pool. It's extraordinary. And so what happened with Sandline really changed things. First of all, it was a dumb idea. The Papua New Guinea Prime Minister forgot to consult the army about it. The army found out about this, probably not through Sister Lorraine, but obviously it wasn't too hard to work out. And an Australian journalist called Mary Louise O'Callaghan broke the story internationally, and bang, the shit hit the fan. The Papua New Guinea, three things happened. Firstly, the New Guinea government, the New Guinea army reacted. They said, "We are not having mercenaries challenging our dominance as the army." And so they staged a coup. There was rioting on the streets of Port Moresby, the capital, and they surrounded Parliament House and they forced a change of government. Basically, a new Prime Minister came in. And whenever you get a change of government, you get the possibility of a change of policy, because governments get wed to policies. A government cannot turn around and say, "Oh, we got that wrong. We need to change that policy." The only way to change a policy is to change government, and that's probably something you're sympathetic to. Anyway, not for me to comment, The second thing that happened out of Sandline was that the Bougainville rebels came to understand that they might actually have something to talk about with the soldiers. They began to see the soldiers, the PNG soldiers, more sympathetically. And the third consequence was that the international community, in particular Australia and New Zealand, just got completely freaked out by the whole event. Mercenaries has a nasty stigma to it. We don't want mercenaries in our area, and that's rightly so. They're horrible. And so there was a flurry of international diplomatic activity in Port Moresby. in the capital of Australia, Canberra, in Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. And the result was a series of peace talks. And basically what happened is the New Zealand government army got 2 aeroplanes. They flew one of them into the north of Bougainville and picked up all the resistance guys and a handful of affiliated women's reps and church reps, including Sister Lorraine. And they went down to an island just south of Bougainville and picked up all the rebels, and they flew both groups of people into Townsville in northern Australia. And then they put them all together on one aeroplane with a division down the middle, right?
Yes. There was a dividing wall in the
middle of the airplane. And they flew them to an army camp in Burnham, New Zealand, which is like kind of Nova Scotia. Nowhere. Sort of natural prejudice against New Zealanders for Australians, but we won't go there. And they sat them in this army camp and said, okay, you got 2 or 3 weeks, work it out. Sister Lorraine, you were at Burnham. Tell us about your experiences.
My experience at Burnham was, I think for the first time, after how many years of conflict, we were doing it ourselves. The chairperson of the negotiations was a Bougainvillean, though he was working with the Papua New Guinea government, but he was a Bougainvillean. And for the 10 days that we had the meetings, he chaired the meeting. And he was very balanced, no? He did not support one side. He was very balanced about how he facilitated the meeting. For us, at the beginning of the first few days of the meetings, it was very difficult for us to see eye to eye. For all of the people in the group, but not me. I used to walk across the border because we were, one group was kept on one side of the camp and we were kept on the other side. But I used to walk across. I would go and spend time there and walk back. The first time I did it, I was told by the New Zealand, one of the army people, he said to me, no, you see, you cannot walk across the border. And I said to him, but I don't seem to see a wall. Where is that Berlin Wall? I can see it. All I see is houses and footpaths, so I'm going to go. So I went. I came back and I said to him, I'm still in one piece because I don't have a gun. So I think for the first week, it was just about, arguing with each other, getting on each other. In the end, because for us, the women, we had already had our negotiations. We did that in Australia the year before. So we had a platform. So from both sides of the meeting room, like while I would get up and say, no, we don't want the war, stop the war. And one other woman would get up from the other side and say, that's true. We don't need to fight. We don't need to have a war to get independence. We don't need that. And then the men started changing, I think our voices were heard. So they started turning the discussions around.
I saw a quote from Marilyn Havini, who she was there. She was telling me about it. So I guess on the one level, women were very forceful in their talking during the Burnham talks. But I guess they were just getting along with each other too. There were women from the rebel side and the resistance side. And you guys got there in the middle of the winter, yeah? See, Bougainville's on the equator, and so they got there in the middle of the winter, and they all wanted to sort of hug each other to stay warm. It kind of helped, huh?
Yeah, for us, the women, it wasn't a problem, Naturally, we just, picked up the momentum and started talking to each other. And during meal times, we started breaking the silence. People started moving and mixing with each other at meal times. And then, one time I asked them a question, excuse me, we are all going to church together. Because every time, the New Zealand government had brought, the army chaplains were made available so that they could organize prayer services and whatever for us. So we were going to church together, and I kept saying to them, excuse me, We are lying to each other. We are going and praying and telling God, we love you, but where is it? We don't even have love for each other. Come on, how come? So, they began to listen, and then they said, that's true. And I think at one of the sessions, I said to them, excuse me, we are supposed to be peace-loving people. That's what we say. It's a common quote in Bougainville that we are peace-loving people, naturally peace-loving people. Where is it? It's not there anymore. We've lost that value. I told them in the meeting, we've lost that value. How can you bring it back? Another thing that we told the men, we said, who are you representing? Your people, your women and children, they are suffering out there. Who are you representing in this room? Don't lie to yourself. We were telling our men that. And then they, common sense. It raised consensus in their minds, so they turned the discussions around.
So the Burnham talks took place in July of 1997 in New Zealand, and they excluded anyone but the Bougainvillians. Amsterdam? Like, they locked the door, it would have been a room like this. And the New Zealanders and Australians stay outside, and the only people in the room were the Bougainvillians. And then they held a second set of talks at a place called Lincoln in early 1998. And there were women's representatives and church representatives there too. And they also included the New Guinea government and the Australian government. And out of all this came a ceasefire agreement in which they promised to stop killing each other, and in which they invited the Australian and New Zealand government to send in a peacekeeping force along with other Pacific islands on the condition that the peacekeeping force come to the island unarmed. Now that was a proposition that completely freaked out the Australian military. They don't like to go anywhere without their guns, but they agreed to do it. Now, Sister, I guess that would seem unusual to people. If the Bougainvillians really wanted peace and security, why didn't they get armed peacekeepers in? What was that decision made?
I think we made the decisions on the grounds that we had enough. We didn't want any more war. And also, by that time, many of us were exposed. I had been working on some UN projects, like there was a project called Women in Armed Conflict. And me and a few other Bougainvillean women were involved in that. And we used to go like overseas to Asia and look at the situation in Asia. Look at Vietnam and Cambodia, in Thailand and in Burma. So we kind of had that sense of, we didn't want peacekeepers, with arms. And even some of our men had already been exposed to other armed conflict situations in other countries. So we knew that we knew what we wanted. We didn't want any more war. We wanted the war to stop. We've had enough. And also, I think for us, it was another way of building trust. We felt that trust was important. And if we had a peacekeeping force that had guns, we knew that we were not going to build trust. Another thing that was also there, in our minds, that, in Bougainville, they didn't really like Australia because of the copper mine. So in order for us to build trust with Australia and that, we need to have a peacekeeping force without a gun. But when we decided that we wanted that, we committed ourselves and we said to ourselves, when they come, we are going to look after them. And also the other thing that we wanted was, we wanted a UN observer mission, a very small team, just to come and be there and observe. Because also from experience, from reading and from observing, we know that everywhere United Nations peacekeeping force go, you know what happens. So we said, no, we are not going there. So we made a commitment that when these people come, we will look after them.
That's interesting, because in 1997, the peace monitoring first arrived. Notice the very ugly yellow shirts. as opposed to camouflage. We were there to be seen, and we stayed on the island for 5 years. There are about 5,000 of us in total, and in that 5-year period, not one peacekeeper was killed. The fact that we were unarmed really worked in that environment because, firstly, as Sister said, it set the moral tone, trust for the whole peace process. This was going to work by trust or not at all. Secondly, because we weren't able to threaten anyone, it made it very clear to the Bougainvillians that we weren't there to impose a peace process, that this was their peace process, which let them take full responsibility for it. And thirdly, it just meant that we had to communicate instead of scaring people, and that kind of helped too. This was some of the sort of more humanitarian work we did while we were there. We used to help out with medical problems every now and then if there was a case where someone was likely to die. This guy had just suffered a gunshot wound to his shoulder and it was likely to get septic, so we flew him over to the army base and fixed him up. So the peace monitors arrived and the peace process began. From 1997 to 1999, it was very much about just letting everything cool down and return to normal. There was a sort of a lot of establishment of relationships and new institutions that were necessary for the peace process. There were difficult issues to be dealt with, particularly with New Guinea. Independence of Bougainville and demilitarisation, surrender of weapons. They were the things that everyone wanted. But it was too early to deal with that. The wounds were too raw, and the people in Bougainville had the wisdom not to attempt to deal with those things until things had chilled out a bit. And so in that period, basically, peace broke out. People left the refugee centres and went back to their villages and planted gardens. The BRA disarmed themselves. And in that period, there are a whole fistful of reconciliation ceremonies. Bougainvillian culture has a tradition of reconciling after conflict, and it's a very localized thing. One guy in one village might have killed the husband of a woman in another village, just next door, and there'll never be peace between the two of them until there's some kind of reconciliation. Sister, could you tell us about those reconciliation ceremonies? It's a very Bougainvillian tradition. I never really understood it myself, and the women in the villages were very involved in it. Is that right?
In most of the reconciliations that have happened so far, the women have kind of like spearheaded that, facilitated that. Because most of those, the issues or the deaths that happened during the conflict, people didn't know where their deaths were buried. And for us, if you do not, in our culture, if you do not bury the dead properly, that means their spirit is not at rest, and it's like wandering, So therefore, there has to be a proper burial. And I was involved in a reconciliation process where a resistant fighter commander killed a young chief in one of the villages where the Interchurch Women's Forum was working. We were working with the people around that area. And the wife didn't know, or the family of the man who was killed didn't know where he was buried. And one time, some of his relatives came to me and spoke to me about how we could help, or how me and the people that were working with me could help to facilitate that. So because there was a peace committee in that area, so we asked them to, I went to the person in charge and said, maybe what you people need to do is to deal with this issue. This wife is looking for the body of her dead husband, and she wants to forgive. So the person in charge went to the man who had killed the other man and asked him to, if he was willing to come forward and tell the wife and be reconciled. And he was ready. So they started a process with, it took about like 6 months to prepare that. It doesn't just happen. So first he identified where they had buried the dead body. And then they both, because this man was from another clan and the man who was killed was from another clan. So both clans prepare for that. And they had discussions whether they would pay a compensation or not pay a compensation. It's not really like paying compensation. It's more like, like they have to sell money.
Symbolic gifts.
Yes, and that's really to maintain the peace. So they had to bring in sell money looks like this. Our sell money looks like this.
Shell money. Little shell
That's
necklaces.
Traditional
they
money,
used to be currency,
local money. And for every yacht, it's worth like 100 kina, like $50 for every meter of this. So they had to give so much of this to, first of all, to maintain peace, or to call the parties together for reconciliation. So they did that, and then eventually the process continued where, in the end, they had to go and dig up the body, bring it to the proper burial grounds, and bring the spirit back home, and then they had the peace at the end of it. This story, it's actually documented.
So what happened in the ceremony itself?
Well, in the ceremony, the people come and they have a ritual for telling each other, that they are sorry, and sometimes it involves Christian prayers, and in this village it was between the Catholics and the United Church. So that means the priest was involved, the minister was involved. So they did all those things. I mean, it's a long process. I don't want to explain that. Anyhow, so they did that. Then they had to bring more sell money. Then they had to have a feast.
Pig died pennies.
Yes.
A pig died.
So they have to have feasting like with pigs, and like that clan has to bring a certain number of pigs and the other clan. It's all part of building that trust and maintaining peace. So that in this particular situation, that's what they did.
Mm. I saw that documentary. It's remarkable, there's a situation where the guy who killed the man comes to the mother and gives her this shell money, and just the whole, everyone is just wailing in tears. It's an incredible thing to watch. We, the Peace Monitoring Group, played an interesting role in this. We understood that this was a cultural thing. It's an interesting hybrid between Christianity and traditional culture. Yeah. And we played a role by providing transport. Like, we got this sort of landing craft and took all these people down to the village and got them all together, stood back and took them out again. And I guess that's an example. Like, we did nothing in the ceremony. We had no control on it, no hand in it. We just provided transport. And I guess that's an example of how the PMG, the Peace Monitoring Group, interacted with women's groups and with... How did you interact with the Peace Monitoring Group? Did you have much to do with Peace Monitors?
At the very beginning of when the peacekeepers came, I had a special task. And my task was to do orientation classes on every Saturday. So they would bring certain members of I think those in charge from all around Bougainville, bring them to North Bougainville, where I was on a Saturday morning, and we'd had classes. Like, I would talk to them about the cultures, things to observe. And one of the things that they used to laugh about was, I used to say to them, now in Bougainville, men value their women, so no playing around. First things first. And they used to laugh at that, and it became a joke. But I think it was also in the information paper that was given that. Another thing, in Bougainville, everybody goes to church on Sunday. So at the beginning of peacekeeping, it was like, every peacekeeper trying to go to church on Sunday. In the end, I told them, just have to forget about that, never mind. So that's what I used to do with the peacekeepers. And then, like every week, we had a consultation. Like the women peacekeepers would come and gather all the women's groups together, have a consultation with them. And sometimes those of us who were kind of like team leaders of certain things would go and consult with them. So it was just like that. It was communicating, giving information. And like, if I knew that somebody was carrying a gun around or whatever, I'd go to the man in charge of the peacekeepers and tell him, this is what's happening. Can you go to the leader of that person and tell him to stop that, not to do that. So we would do things like that. So that was my role in the helping peacekeepers, and that was one way I was saying, I have to protect these people. I asked for them to come unarmed, so now I will do my small part in this in the peace process by protecting them. And at the very beginning also, in the areas where that was more remote and controlled by the rebels, I went with them, and it was actually the rebel leaders who said that, who said to me, when the peacekeepers come, make sure you come with them this way. You cannot send them by themselves. Until they get to know the place, then they can travel by themselves. So, and it was like, I was trying to do my own work, and I had to do this, but in me, I had committed to the peace process. I said, I will look after them when they come. So that's what we did. And I even organized women, like women in our network, all around the island. When peacekeepers come, please look after them. Make sure you give them the information that they are asking for. Or if there is any information that you think they must know, so that they can bring it to the leaders. Because by that time, some of us were not very involved in high consultation, at the highest level. So we made sure that women were given information, and that information was getting up to the people at the highest level. So we were doing small things like that.
I tried to go to church every Sunday, but there's no pews. They have these lengths of 4x2 about a foot off the ground, and butt really got sore. But it was critical. Going to church was a very important part of what we did, because that's where the community met. And I did go every Sunday. So during this time, the Bougainvillians started to unite. They got together and formed a thing called the Bougainville Reconciliation Government. So what they did was they got together and they started to talk over their own positions, their own desire for independence, how to achieve it, how strong it was, what conditions they wanted. And this was a fundamental thing about the peace process, sister, that the Bougainvillians always sought to get solidarity before they talked to the Australians, before they talked to the New Guineans. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about this peace process and why it worked. And women were involved in the Bougainville Reconciliation Government. It was like an informal government that met to discuss things. Can you remember your involvement in that?
I was not directly involved, but we had women. We appointed women, like we appointed 6 women who could be part of that government. And the 6 of them, like 3 represented the 3 regions, and 3 others represented organizations, like women's organizations, in the reconciliation government. That reconciliation government was made up of both the part that represented Papua New Guinea and the part that represented the rebel government. So it was like a merging of the 2 governments. And we had 6 women representing us.
And you were also involved during that time in development work, is that right?
Yes. Because of the fact that, like I was really at the heart of it, working with people throughout the time of the conflict, I knew that as soon as ceasefire came, it was important to start doing development work. It's just like getting people to resettle back into their villages, try to improve the quality of life, because most of the people had, like in the villages, most of the villages were burnt down, torched down by the rebels and the defense force. So we were doing that kind of thing, like bringing them back to their villages, resettling them. And we started teaching literacy, because many of the youth between the age of 15 and 25 had missed out on their schooling for 8 to 10 years of the war. So we started running literacy, adult classes, or classes for for the youth, just to help them so that they could get back into the formal system. So my organization was doing that. We were also trying to help people come for trauma counseling. And we have another women's organization who did trauma counseling. We had the Catholic Church was already established and doing trauma counseling. So we kind of, we did all those things prepare for some kind of healing, rebuilding, reconstructing Bougainville after the conflict. And even in the later part of the peace process, there were 8 agencies coming to Bougainville. Oxfam is one of them. And they started establishing projects for rehabilitation and other NGOs, mostly from Australia and New Zealand. So we were kind of like trying to network and work with them to help reestablish the services, education, health, after the conflict.
So then there was kind of a second phase of the peace process where the Bougainvillians negotiated with the New Guinea government on the key issues of independence, disarmament and reconciliation. And there were some very intense negotiating sessions during which probably women were pretty much excluded from this process for some reason. Is that right? From the negotiations for the Bougainville peace agreement with New Guinea?
Yes, it came to a stage where women were no longer involved at that level of consultation. But even though it happened at the level where I was working, we were very conscious of what was going on. Like, we got women to listen to the news every day. Radio Bougainville every day has, there's news about every night. So we were getting women to listen to the news. We were getting women to go to peace meetings and just find out what was going on, what was happening. So by doing that, when decisions were being made without us being consulted, it was my task really to go in and tell these people, excuse, what's going on? We did not give our thoughts to that decision.
Why do you think it is that women were eventually excluded from that higher political level? Is it customary culture? Is it prejudice from men? Is it other difficulties with the workload? Or?
I think it wasn't really the case in this. It wasn't that. I don't see it that way. It's just that, like they were beginning to kind of trim down on the number of people that they were bringing in. And by doing that, the women were left out. But I don't kind of like feel that we were totally left out, because behind the kitchen door consultation is always there. Grassroots peace building.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be consulted behind the kitchen door. Anyway, the Bougainville Peace Agreement came out in 2001. It was the result of some really torrid, intense negotiations. As I said, 2 years, 20 sessions. It just went on and on and on. It was a tough issue. New Guinea did not want to give independence to Bougainville because if they did that, all the other provinces would also want independence. So they're trying to draw a line in the sand. However, on the other hand, they realised they'd lost the war. So they really had no leverage. And anyway, an outcome was reached, the Bougainville Peace Agreement, and it was a really brilliant document that kind of solved a lot of the tough issues. On the question of independence, they decided to have a deferred election, a deferred referendum on whether people in Bougainville wanted to be separate. So they promised that in 10 to 15 years' time, the Bougainvillians would be entitled to a referendum to decide whether they wanted to be independent. And that kind of postponed the difficult issue and gave the Bougainvillians what they wanted from the short term. Secondly, this question of deferred referendum was only going to happen if the Bougainville rebels demilitarised, if they surrendered their weapons, and the New Guinea government made it a condition for their promises that the Bougainvillians surrendered their weapons. And also a higher level of autonomy was promised for the Bougainville government. They were promised the opportunity to have an autonomous Bougainville government. All of these promises were contingent on the Bougainville rebels surrendering their weapons. So it was a genius of a document insofar as everyone got what they wanted, and these promises were to be contingent on the Guineans getting what they wanted, and all of this was going to be embedded in the Constitution. Now, governments changed, the Constitution stayed the same, so it served a great purpose. Now, 1958 back then. Then the peace process entered a third phase. Basically, the peace agreement was implemented. The weapons were surrendered. Peace monitors went around and collected 2,000 weapons in peace ceremonies between 2001 and 2003. And it was a process that was this process of weapons collection was extraordinary. The Australian and New Zealand governments got 26 shipping containers, tied them to the bottom of helicopters, dropped them in villages all over the island, and then allowed the Bougainvillians to organise a bunch of ceremonies whereby the combatants would cop up their weapons, we would register them, put them under a padlock, and lock them away. And it was a process that was very much driven by, at the official level, by the combatant leaders. They threatened their boys and said, now, give your weapons back. It's hard to talk boys into getting rid of their weapons, particularly if they're not sure if the guy down the street's got rid of his yet. So, Sister, what level of involvement did women have in the whole weapons disposal process?
In 2001, we actually held a Bougainville Women's Summit. And at the Bougainville Women's Summit, one of the things that we demanded for was that there must be total weapon disposal. And we made it our task to speak to the ex-combatants to hand in their weapons. So when that happened in South Bougainville, the women themselves went forward. They got their sons, their husbands or whatever, to bring out their guns, take them to the peace ceremony and into the containers.
So in response to this, the New Guinea government kept its promises. PNG troops withdrew and all the provisions for the referendum and the autonomous government were embedded in the constitution of Papua New Guinea. And then the peace monitors departed in June 2003. And as you could see from the documentary at the start, there was a lot of fear about what would happen after the peace monitors went. But it worked out okay, sister? What was your feelings about what happened when the peace monitors left in June 2003?
When the peacekeepers were leaving, there was a lot of reservations that war might break out. But for people like myself, we encouraged the people and we said to them, this peace process is not the peacekeepers' process. It's not Australia's process. It's not New Zealand's process. It's our process. So we need to look after this process. And since after the peacekeepers left, though there have been small things happening, the process is being maintained. Because from the lowest level to the highest level, Bougainvillians have made a commitment to keep the peace, to sustain the peace. So that's my experience.
One of the things for the new government was putting together a new constitution. A new constitution really forms the bedrock of any new society, and there was a process called there's a wide set of consultations to form a new constitution. Can you tell us the story of women's involvement in that process of forming a new constitution?
In forming the constitutions and formulating the constitutions of Bougainville, at the forum, what we did was, at the Interchurch Women's Forum, we have a special desk, and we call it Women's Peace Education. And that desk looks after anything to do with peace. So we organized for women to be trained, to go to the villages and organize the people so that they can contribute their thoughts, their ideas to what they want written down in the constitutions. Because we explain to the people that whatever goes into these new constitutions has to come from the people. So we did all those things, and we even organized the youth to help us do that. Go to the villages, carry out awareness, prepare the people, get the people to start thinking about what they wanted down in the constitutions.
So a constitution resulted, which was signed in June 2004, and 3 positions were guaranteed for women?
Yeah, because of that and because of our desk. We also organized what we call, we have developed a program which we call From Village to Parliament. Bougainville Women Vision for the Future. And this program deals with training women how to participate in decision making from the lowest level to the highest level. So we trained 50 women to do that. And out of the 50 women, 3 of them have seats in Parliament. And
So there were 3 guaranteed positions in the Parliament. 3 for women. How many for ex-combatants?
3.
So when people voted, they had 4 columns. One was for president, one was for ex-combatants representative, one was for women's representative, and then one was from their particular area, you know, like their district. Sister, do you think that was a good idea that they promised women positions in the government, or do you think it should have been left more open?
I think also that there is an allowance in the Constitution that women can stand in their constituency. It doesn't stop them. But we encourage, like I encouraged a lot of women to stand in their constituencies and not just go for the 3 seats. But I don't know, never mind, long story. But now they are, you know, like this program continues, and now women are saying, come next elections in 2010, constituencies, more women for their constituencies.
It's interesting. So 2005, they had elections for a new autonomous government. They went well, and a new government's been formed, which really capped the end of a remarkable peace process that was really driven by the people of Bougainville. And it's an interesting story. It's a story we like to tell. So, Sister, 2005, 2007, what have you been up to?
2005 up to 2007. In 2005, I don't work at BICWF anymore, at the Women's Forum, but I still do a lot of work to help them. So for 6 months in 2005, I helped them to design a program to help people on Bougainville create a safe, secure, and just society. That's the theme of the program. And it's about reorganizing people around social justice issues, resettling people, rebuilding their lives, proper water, proper hygiene, sanitation. So that's what this project deals with. And we have trained like local leaders to carry out that program. So in 2005, I was doing that. And also, I'm currently working with the Nazareth Rehabilitation Center. The center was established in 2005 by my order to provide like a safe house for people suffering from trauma, women and children suffering from violence, so that, you know, they have a place where they can go to and you know, find safety and get counseling and just recover from whatever they are suffering from. And these 2 initiatives, the initiative about building a safe society, and that is totally, it's funded by Bread for the World in Germany. Because it has a popular education approach, so Bread for the World in Germany likes to do that kind of thing. The Nazareth Rehabilitation Program is not funded. It's totally self-supported. And that means I have a group of Bougainvillians who help me to raise money. And it doesn't matter where I'm in debt or whatever, I just forget about it and continue.
Well, that kind of wraps up what we've got to talk about today. Is anyone got any questions for us? Gent with the...
There's microphones at the side. You can go ahead and use those.
Other than educating the refugees and getting them caught up to speed after missing as many as 10 years of school, what were some other specific challenges of the redevelopment process?
Challenges in the redevelopment process?
The people who were displaced during the conflict, they never really saw themselves as refugees. Because what happened, and I used to work with that, and mostly these people were in government centers. It was centers that the government and the defense force put up. So whenever we knew that they were setting up a care center, we would immediately go and help the people, help them to settle down, and actually help them to make gardens so that they were not dependent on food or whatever that was given by the government. So they would stay there for 4 or 5 years, 6 years. And whenever fighting slowed down in their area, they just moved back into their villages. And now I think that another way we are helping them is through that program. But many of the things that we do are not based on money. They are based on people's initiative.
Question?
Yes. Both of you have mentioned that everybody goes to church on Sunday. Now, this is a minor question, but if I took that literally, that would mean that the Seventh-day Adventists go to church on Sunday. Could you explain this?
They go to church on Saturday. So if I am holding a meeting that includes 7 days and it's a Saturday, we stop the meeting. They go and have their church service and whatever. So they still go to church on Saturday. But it's the Seventh-day Adventist church in Bougainville has a very small number, and it's mostly located in like one small section of the island and that.
Well, I think we've got a few people to thank here before we close things up. Big Bella, thank you. That's Pigeon. We're going to have a Pigeon sing-along before we go. You all know Pigeon, don't you? We want to thank Ben and all the tech crew here. Thanks, guys. It's been great. Very much appreciate your work. We'd really like to thank Walter and Bill Smith, who's done an amazing job getting Sister Lorraine here. Getting a visa for a nun from Papua New Guinea is a pretty exotic business, and it took about a month of hard labour, but Bill has now developed expertise in the importation of Papua New Guinean nuns, and we could all use someone like Sister Lorraine. Let's pray for Sister Lorraine. She's a real hero of mine. If you'd like to make contributions to the work she does, come and talk to her afterwards. She does some wonderful work, believe me. She's a real hero of mine, incredible courage during the conflict, and a remarkable woman. She speaks 6 languages. She's been nominated for one of the 1,000 Nobel Peace Prizes. And I've got some CDs here. And if you want to buy them, I'll donate $10 from each sale to her. Now, Sister, you're doing some work on Radio Bougainville now, is that right?
Yes. I started this year by doing a program on Radio Bougainville, and it's called Walkabout Long Place. It's like walking through the villages. So on the program, on this program, what we do is we tell people how they should walk through their village and walk around their village and look at what they need to do to improve the quality of life. And it's become a very popular program, not just in Bougainville, but in the Pacific, because it's broadcast on ABC, Radio Australia PNG service. And I have friends from the Pacific sending me emails saying that, oh, we listen to your program on Radio Australia, Walkabout Long Place.
You're famous now. I had a show on Radio Bougainville every Saturday night called Saturday Night Party, where we'd kind of we'd get into people in, we'd interview people and talk about the peace process. And I had this guy called Mr. Green, who was the resident horticulturalist. And he would come in and he'd play his favourite records. He'd give people advice for 5 minutes on how to plant their gardens. and how to deal with garden waste. And then he'd play something from his old record collection, and he really loved Creedence Clearwater Revival, Peter, Paul and Mary, and he really got right into the Kinks. It was a quirky collection, you know. But I understand that now they're broadcasting from 4 p.m. to like 11 p.m.?
Yes, 4 p.m. In the evening to 11 p.m. at night, and 4 p.m. in the morning, a.m. to 8 a.m. in the morning.
Is that right? When I was there, they only broadcast from like, was it 5 p.m. to 9 p.m.? Well, basically what happened was the town generator would run out of diesel. So they'd have the Bible reading at 8:45 every night. Like Aloysius, he's there. Papa Deo ben saran bikini bong, dark. You'd find a torch, you'd make your way out. And back then there were 5 guys working there. There was a guy called Stalin, a guy called Karl Marx, 3 guys called Aloysius. But anyway, I wanted to write them a jingle, you know, like a song that they could put on the radio to advertise themselves. And so I wrote them this jingle called Radio Bougainville. And I took it in and I played it to them. I said, "What do you think of that, fellas?" And they said, "Well, Fred," they call me Fred there, "it's pretty cheesy." So yeah, I know, it's a jingle. But anyway, you can sing along. It goes, Radio Bougainville, which is pidgin for Radio Bougainville. Long Booker Island, on Booker Island, which is where Sister's from. Sing, sing, long Bougainville, sing to Bougainville. Keeping you smiling, keeping you smiling. So try singing that. Radio Bougainville, Long Booker Island. Sing, sing, long Bougainville, keeping you smiling. Now, one of the problems in Bougainville is they don't have any trumpets, so you're going to have to play the trumpet part too. It goes... You got it. Right, everyone stand up. On your feet. You've been on your bums for a long time. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Blessing, sidelong PNG. Come me like go back long Bougainville, and #1 on me, Radio Bougainville, along Booker Island, sing, sing, long Bougainville, keeping you smiling again. Radio Bougainville, long Booker Island, sing, sing, long Bougainville, keeping you smiling. I had a band in Bougainville, and I invited Sister Lorraine to come and see me one time. I said, "Sister, we're going to be playing rock and roll in the park." And she said, I remember it well, you said, "I hate rock and roll." She hates rock and roll, but she rocks. Please, another round of applause for Sister Lorraine.